Good morning, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this seminar this morning, the HEPI Advance HE joint seminars. Normally, we would be doing these as a breakfast event, House of Commons, as I know many of you recall. Sadly, we haven't been able to do that yet, but we're hoping to make sure our third one actually happens there and we can meet in person. I'm Alison Johns, I'm the Chief Executive of Advance HE. We're absolutely delighted on our partnership with HEPI because I think it's meetings like this where we get together, where we talk about some of the really important issues in higher education. And today there can't really be much more of an important question really, can there, about what is the future of higher education? And I think I'd like to add into that, what's the future for a sustainable higher education? And what kind of higher education institutions, what will they look like in future? We've got a great lineup of speakers to begin to address that for us, and Nick will introduce them to you in a moment. I just thought I'd share a few thoughts because I found it a very interesting question myself. We all know that universities have been around for a very, very long time. And I was reflecting on the University of Bologna, a continuous existence for over 900 years now. And it's interesting when I looked at it, they actually shared a lot of the challenges that we face today. Very much student power, because the student actually paid the fees there and the students could actually find their teachers, and they did take the initiative to do this for unpunctuality, poor performance. And if we looked at the statutes of 1252, it showed that the students actually set the curriculum by way of a legal contract in terms of setting out what they wish their teachers to teach them. Before any policymakers hear about this and think, oh, that's a great idea, why don't we go down that track? There was, of course, a bit of a backlash, and the cathedral schools in Paris actually funded the educational processes, and the lecturers or the teachers there were much more concerned about the church's power to define the curriculum and the academic thought. And paradoxically, though, it was Pope Alexander III who actually saw the benefits of providing protection and autonomy for these teachers to really get the best out of the scholarly activity and the learning for the students. So, you know, all those years ago, similar problems and challenges to the way that the policy issues that we face today. So where am I going with all this? I just think it's interesting. Higher education's been around for a long time. It will be. How do we make it sustainable? And so I'd just like to share my thoughts on what shaped the future of higher education. And just four, I would say, contested ideas or notions around universities. They're very much the traditional idea of a university, very much derived from the past, and which is often, I think, is seen as present in resistance mode, seen as not wanting to change. And the big question there is a question of survival. Then there's the managerial idea of a university. I started my career 30 years ago in HE, and managerialism was being talked about then. But something which really sort of shapes a university in terms of its form and purpose, that being its legitimacy. And the question here is a university selling its soul to the government or to the ministry, to the establishment in terms of its role or purpose? The next perhaps being a reframed idea, which is the reframing very much emerging from within the university and shaping initiatives which have a social purpose, very often regionally and focused, maybe along the lines of the civic mission of many of the universities that we see today. And then finally, the dismissive idea. The real question, do we need universities? Do we need them in the leadership role that they've taken in the past? And the whole idea of what that is emerging from outside, driven by things like artificial intelligence, the emergence of new ways of learning and doing things very differently. And we see a lot of challenges and disruptors coming into the market now. So those are just some initial thoughts that the question stimulated for me. And as I said, we've got a great panel who will give their views and reflections on the future and the shape of higher education to come. So it's my great pleasure to hand across now to Nick, who will introduce our speakers, and then we'll chair the session and discussion afterwards. Thank you very much, Nick.
Well, thank you so much, Alison. It's fantastic. I think you started with history because, of course, the history of our sector will also help us guide the future. And I couldn't help thinking of the Levelling Up white paper when you were talking about challenges, because there's some interesting paragraphs in there on that. So let's move to our three speakers at this HEPI Advance HE webinar. First, we're going to hear from Rachel Sylvester. Many of you will have read millions of words probably that Rachel's written over the years. She's been at the Times as a journalist since 2008. She's a former Political Journalist of the Year and a former Journalist of the Year as well. She currently leads the Times Education Commission, and many of you will have heard her on the Today programme earlier this week talking about the role of political spouses. After Rachel, we'll hear from Ross. It's a bit like Friends, this. We've got Rachel and Ross this morning. We're going to hear from Ross, who's principal of ARU, Anglia Ruskin University, Peterborough. Peterborough is the second largest urban area in the country with no higher education institution of its own, but Ross is solving that. And many of you will have come across him in his previous roles. So he was a PVC at the University of Worcester. He was Dean of Students at the University of Hertfordshire. He's an expert on lots of things, actually, but particularly on widening participation and access. And then after Ross, we'll hear from Conor Ryan, who's Director of External Relations at the Office for Students, which is England's regulator, not the regulator of the whole UK, but England's regulator. He was previously Director of Research at the Sutton Trust for 6 years. And before that, he worked as an education advisor in number 10 Downing Street for Tony Blair. He was also a special advisor to David Blunkett when he was the Secretary of State for Education. We've asked our three speakers to speak for between 7 and 10 minutes each, which will then give us enough time to do questions afterwards. So do please put questions in the Q&A, and do please upvote the questions you particularly want to see asked. And then the other thing to say is do please keep the conversation going on social media as well. I suggest maybe the hashtag #FutureHE. But with no further ado, let's go over to you, Rachel.
Thanks so much, Nick, and it's great to be here. I'm a huge admirer of HEPI and the Times Education Commission. We're taking a really broad look at the whole of education, all the way through from early years through to higher education and even lifelong learning, because it just felt like once you start looking at one bit, if you start to disentangle the tapestry, it all falls apart and everything all links up together. So we're taking evidence on each of those areas, and we haven't actually yet got to the evidence on higher education. So I'm really in listening mode rather than lecturing mode. But there are a few thoughts that have started to emerge already from the Education Commission that are very much relevant to higher education that I thought I would share, you might find of interest. And one of the key themes that I've found most fascinating is the disconnect between education and employment. So we have done surveys, or PwC did a survey of business on behalf of the Commission, which found that almost half of businesses think that higher education doesn't prepare children for the work. It doesn't give young people the skills they need to be prepared for work. And that these companies, they wanted more focus on problem solving, teamwork, communication, and creativity. Our polling of parents showed that 2/3 of parents think that the education system as a whole, including universities, don't prepare children for either life or work. And that parents are now much more evenly divided about what they feel they want their children to do. So 1/3 roughly felt that they would aspire to their children to go to university, and 1/3, roughly equal proportion, said they would prefer their child to have some kind of vocational training, such as an apprenticeship. So I thought that was really fascinating. And there's also a sort of economic as well as a social justice argument for reform and for a greater connection between education and employment. The Commercial Education Trust has done an analysis which found that over 75% of businesses said that their profitability could be increased by 25% if young people left school, college or university better prepared for the workplace. So I think there is a real challenge there for higher education as well as for the rest of the system about reconnecting education with the workplace. And obviously you don't want, I wouldn't want education just to be a sort of conveyor belt to a job, but you do feel that there needs to be some sense of preparing young people for a life to be productive members of society. And And all the other themes that have emerged in our research apply just as acutely to higher education as to the rest of the system. So whether that's stalled social mobility, whether that's the mental health crisis, whether that's a sort of agonizing over the role of technology and the failure of the system to properly deploy technology in many cases. Often it feels as if the education system is an analog system in a digital age. And universities, along with schools, have come on leaps and bounds during the pandemic. But there's still a lot to learn, I think, from other countries and from the private sector in terms of really using technology most effectively. And then, of course, there are all the questions about the pandemic. How much should the balance be between online learning and in-person learning? You know, the universities are going to be picking up dealing with the consequences of grade inflation and exams, all kinds of challenges. But also, I feel really strongly, and the Commission feels really strongly, that this is a kind of really important reset moment for the whole education system, including higher education. And that it's almost as if the system's been switched on and off again, like a computer, and that it is possible to really think again about the priorities and perhaps reshape some of the institutions and some of the thinking. So I think there are some questions that have come up and that I'm really interested to explore. I'm interested to hear views of people here, but also a sense of the need for more flexibility, perhaps, and more variety in higher education, different models to the standard 3-year degree, whether that's accelerated 2-year degrees or more modular courses. I was really fascinated. I went to see Gary Neville's new university, UA92, which is right next to the old Trafford stadium where he played for so many years in Manchester United. And they have, you can join 3 points in the year. They have 6-week modules. They have you can do it in an accelerated form, and they have very clear connections between the education that they're offering and the workplace. So they have work placements integrated into the degree, and they're very much focused on getting disadvantaged pupils and also mature students. So I found that really interesting as a model, that there isn't any longer a kind of one-size-fits-all version of higher education. Similarly, I went to see James Dyson's university, which is an entirely degree apprenticeship model. So you don't pay any fees, and in fact you earn a salary. And I think that may be becoming increasingly attractive for some young people. Certainly the people who were on that course felt that they had the best of both worlds. They got a training, they got a degree, they got to live in a James Dyson designed pod, even with a desk designed by him, and they were guaranteed a job at the end. It's very different, and those courses are more heavily subscribed than some Oxbridge degrees. So there's definitely a shift going on already. The other thing I wanted to mention is that I think the politics of all this is really interesting, and in some ways quite depressing. So some Conservatives are pretty open that graduates just don't vote Tory. So they want to minimise the number of people going on to university under the new. This is a sort of real shift in the Conservatives' electoral base since Brexit and under Boris Johnson. So there's been quite a cynical attempt, I think, in some cases to criticise universities. In many ways, the government's main focus in terms of higher education has been culture wars, freedom of information, very little there've been talk of number caps, graduate salaries as the measure of success, all the things that there's a sort of sense that I think among some Conservatives that they don't want to create too many more liberal, lefty, Remainy graduates. They want to sort of keep their core base. David Willetts in a recent article quoted President Trump remark that I love the poorly educated, and that sort of hovers in the background of some of this debate in quite a depressing way. The interesting figures are that at the last election, the Conservatives beat Labour 44% to 32%, but among graduates, the Tories trailed Labour by 14 points and polled a mere 29%. So I think it's worth being aware of the electoral realities of this at the moment, although how long that will last if there's a change of Prime Minister. But sort of mitigating against that is the reality of aspiration and the reality of people's hopes and dreams. And that most parents do want their children to go to university still, if they or go on to higher education of some form. Most young people do want to do aspire to that. And Tony Blair and Andrew Adonis, when they gave evidence to the Education Commission, they proposed increasing, far from sort of moving away from the 50% target. They said it should be higher. And they wanted 46 new universities in towns in England where there are none, many of which are in those sort of red wall seats that the Tories won from Labour at the last election. And they suggested that FE colleges could be promoted to polytechnics. So I think there's a kind of political battle to be fought here. And interestingly, I feel that Nadeem Zahawi is much less interested in culture wars than his predecessors and much more pragmatic. He was a businessman. He's interested in delivery, and I think he'll be less knee-jerk in a sort of anti-university cultural way. So I think there's an openness there, but I do think also that universities have to move with the times, have to modernise, and have to think of there needs to be more flexibility and agility in the system.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you. Just before you go and we move to Ross, can I just put, can you just remind people if they want to feed information into the Times Education Commission, how they might do that, and also what your time frame is for the HE aspects?
Yeah, of course. I'd really love to hear from everyone here. So we're taking written submissions. There's a dedicated email address, which is educationcommission@thetimes.co.uk. And in terms of the time frame, we published an interim report last month, which dealt mainly with schools because we haven't yet taken evidence on higher education. We're going to be coming on to that. I think it's in April. We'll be having 2 evidence sessions on HE and FE. And then also the final report will be published in June, where we'll be hoping to we will be making recommendations for reform. So I think we'd be really keen to have input from anyone and as wide a range of views as possible.
Great, thank you, Rachel. That's very clear. Thanks for your remarks. Just before I go to Ross, just remind people there's lots of interesting comments in the chat, some of which we might turn into questions. But if you've got specific questions for the panelists, do put them in the Q&A as well as Steve has just done. Ross, over to you.
Good morning, Nick, and thank you to HEPI and Advance HE for inviting me this morning. Look, I'm going to be upbeat. I might be foolish in being upbeat because I've got 214 days, 22 hours and 5 minutes and 2 seconds before my new institution opens. But I think there's good reason to be upbeat about the future of higher education. I plan just to touch on a little bit about the now and what's happening just now and why that informs the future. For me, I think the positives are really stark about our sector. Despite the headlines, I think our universities are remarkable places. We're highly ranked globally. We have a high rates of retention and satisfaction. Compare us to the US as a good example. We get high levels of participation in HE. Of course, can be better, but it is high levels of participation compared to many other countries. We have got significant impact on our communities, both economically and culturally. And just look at the Civic Universities Commission and the evidence that was given there about the impact we have, the permeability we have as institutions. But also, more recently, we've had a fundamental role in the response to COVID. Our research, without a doubt, has saved lives. Our workforce has made sure the NHS is to be able to continue and thrive through that time as much as it could. Our ability to get things done is recognised. We set up testing centres, we gave our facilities up, and we worked with communities to ensure they were steered and supported through COVID. We provided civic leadership. I think there is challenges, however, in our current higher education. The inability for us to effectively articulate our purpose to the public. you can see it in the arguments, whether it be the freedom of speech, some of the recent announcements bringing back the familiar Mickey Mouse degree type arguments. The narratives have not been made effectively by us as a sector to the general public about what benefit we give within our communities locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally. And I think that's our role to do. Our funding system is not fit for purpose. And I'd argue we are waiting for others to tell us the outcome of this. So we've been waiting for the Auger report for a painfully long time. I would argue that it's our role to find some of these tricky solutions to our sector. We need to invest in our universities, make the argument about investing in higher education and what that benefit is to society. I also think we've failed to set the policy agenda around skills and future workforce. We should be front and centre in some of the arguments around this. And if you read the Levelling Up white paper, there is huge amounts of nods towards the sector, but I think we could be even more integrated in the success of levelling up the country. As a sector, I think we also need to do more work around our collaboration with industry. This year will be 10 years since the Wilson report on university and business collaborations. And if you reflect on that, see how much progress we've made as a sector compared to the aspirations that were set out in that report. And I think our civic leadership role is needed more than ever. And you look at some of the struggling local authorities and the challenges within communities. We also have challenges around metrics. We need to avoid their metrics swamping the innovation within the sector. There's a risk that it reduces our risk appetite. The data sets don't represent students or the needs of society. We need to make sure there's a rounded view of our sector. And our autonomy is constantly under threat. What we do, who we admit, and who we teach. We need to make sure that what we're doing is in the best interest of the country, and we're setting out that agenda. So looking to the future, as I say, I'm optimistic about what we can do. I believe we have an important role in levelling up. Whether you like or loathe the term, there is a role to ensure that all parts of this country benefit from economic growth and the prosperity that it brings. I think we are good at getting things done, so we need to make sure that that's understood by the key policymakers. Look at our advanced manufacturing centres across the country, Teesside, Coventry and the like, where there's been real success in bringing together business and universities. I do think, and this is where I'll agree with Rachel Sylvester on this, we need to be more responsive. We need to be quicker to develop provision, to adapt and shape our environment. And I think the traditional structures, quite rightly, are under threat. But we also need to diversify our sector. We need new modes of delivery. And I'm encouraged by the new lifelong loan entitlement, but we need to make sure that's implemented in a way that allows students from all backgrounds at all stages in life are able to access higher education at the pace that they require and at the stage where it benefits both them, but also the sectors they're working in. I think the 3-year undergraduate degree should and will become less important within our system, but that will take a long period of time to do. And I touched on new models of universities. I'm sitting not quite in one because our building isn't ready yet, but ARU Peterborough is a new model of university. It will be opening this year in September. We've already got our courses out into UCAS. And it's a university that's got a massive role to fulfill. It's a new institution for an area where there's industrial and rural deprivation. There's a partnership really quite uniquely between an existing university, Anglia-Ruskin University, the Combined Authority and the City Council. And I have to say the vision that Anglia-Ruskin have put into this and the resource and energy, I think is one of the reasons it will be successful. And it's on a pathway to be independent. So it's not about any one of these organisations benefiting themselves. It's about how it benefits the community. And the reason it's needed, as Nick already mentioned, I'm sitting in one of the HE cold spots in the country. We've got a population of 217,000 here. We've got poor educational attainment. We've got low progression into high-skilled jobs. We've got a low-skill economy. There's poor health outcomes. And crucially for me, There's low levels of social mobility, so very low movement into some of those emerging industries that we talk about as a country, they talk about as a future. But we have seen success. We've had over £75 million of investment already. We've got a clear vision to build a high-skilled economy here in Peterborough and for the Fenlands and beyond. And we're co-creating this institution with industry and the community. From the courses to the buildings, we have no fences or walls. There's true permeability in what we're doing. Our curriculum has been designed with over 150 companies. I've got 50 of them down the stairs just now, signing up to our degree apprenticeship pledge, where they'll commit to taking apprentices on to help the growth of their organisations. And even by the building, it won't be familiar to those who are sitting in universities that are 100 years old. There's no lecture theatres. The interactions with our students are about problem solving, about collaboration. The social interactions are important, but merging that with the digital opportunities that we have. For me, we need a system that meets the needs of industry and students going forward. Already U92 has been mentioned, and I am encouraged by their multiple points of entry. I think it's a really encouraging model. It meets the needs of the students and industries. But we also need to be efficient, and we need to be able to articulately argue why we're efficient as institutions. So what benefits are we providing beyond just the degree in hand? What innovation, what research are we impacting on people's lives within the communities in which we exist? And we need to make sure that there's real innovation clusters. We're taking the opportunity in areas of the country which haven't been touched by research and some of the innovation that we'd see in already very established university towns and cities. How do we make sure that gets to those areas and they see the benefit of it? And for me, technology is only an enabler. We need to make sure that our asset, our main asset, that is our people, are developed and supported. And the work that Advance HE doing this is important. We need to make sure that our workforces are ready to meet those challenges going forwards. I also set the challenge that we need an integrated approach to regional planning, so that universities are front and centre in that, from transport planning to skills, housing and inward investment. We need our universities to be the leaders within those areas, really contributing to see the benefits that can be across the entire country. And there's a risk of us navel gazing. There's a risk of us looking too much at the macro. And I'm keen for us as institutions to still retain our global outlook. Our competitors often aren't those down the train line. There'll be those in China, there'll be those in India, South Korea, Germany and beyond. And 20 years on from Lord Deering's report, there is a very small quote that I want to share with you, which is, just as castles provided the source of strength for medieval towns and factories provided prosperity in the industrial age, universities are the source of strength in the knowledge-based economy of the 21st century. 20 years on, this still rings true. Thank you.
Thank you, Ross. Ron Deering was HEPI's first chair, so it's great to hear a reference to him. I'm going to go, no further ado, over to Conor, Conor Ryan from the Office for Students. And just before I do so, do keep the Q&A and the chat going. There's lots of interesting comments coming in. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nick, and well done on organising this series of seminars. It's interesting and encouraging to see how many people are joining this morning. I want briefly to focus on three areas where I think the sector will see important changes in the coming years, and as you might expect, some of them have a regulatory flavour. And in doing so, I recognise there are plenty of other challenges, demographic, financial and otherwise. But I think it's important that the sector sees these changes as a real opportunity to improve, not just for their students, but also in the sort of public respect that Rachel was talking about earlier. And the three issues I want to focus on are quality, digitisation and access. And to some extent, these are issues that have been thrown into sharp relief by the pandemic. But quality and access are a core focus for us at the Office for Students as the regulator too. And the more diversity and innovation, the more important that we have the right sort of regulation. As Nick alluded in his introduction, in my past life, I have had a lot of experience of debates on quality and standards in education, including the use of data and metrics, but mainly at the level of schools. And I worked with David Blunkett when he set targets for primary school attainment and floor standards in secondary school. One thing that both did was to drive up what was acceptable as a minimum standard, and the approach was adopted by successive governments. Higher education, it's probably fair to say, has not necessarily had similar regulatory expectations before now. So the new thresholds on which the OFS is consulting are a significant change for the sector. But it's important to note that they are accompanied by proposals for a sharpened teaching excellence framework, which incentivizes improvement above the baseline and offers the chance for the sort of rounded view, which Ross alluded to. Our proposed thresholds are focused on continuation, completion, and postgraduate employment or study, with powers to intervene with where these thresholds aren't met. And it's important to note, once context has been fully taken into account, because I think some accounts of what we're proposing haven't noted that last point. And we think that these changes should lead to a cultural shift in the sector, but they are the norm in other sectors with significant taxpayer funding. Minimum standards have not only been introduced in schools, they're important in health too, where waiting time targets have been a part of the landscape for 2 decades. Thresholds can help drive out low quality courses, but they are minimum expectations, not an ambitious goal. So they're focused on the poorest performers, and that's why the TEF is important. And there, the proposal to add a requires improvement category while maintaining gold, silver, and bronze ratings will align our approach while incentivizing improvement in teaching and outcomes. Quality has come to the fore because of the pandemic, and despite the hard work of many universities and their staff, students did have a variable experience in how their courses were delivered. And this has arguably led to a greater focus on student expectations in a way I think that the increases in maximum fees in 2012 and 2006 didn't lead to as much as was expected. And those higher expectations, I think it's important the sector realizes, will not diminish as we exit the worst of the pandemic. But the pandemic has also highlighted how much students rightly expect good teaching and good results from their higher education experience. So last year's National Student Survey showed significant dips in those who were positive about their teaching or resources. Though those who were critical were still a minority, it's important to say, and the majority still felt that they had a good experience. But the extra questions we asked found that only 48% said, for example, that they were content with the delivery of learning and teaching of their course during the pandemic. So I think there will be important lessons from all of that. And I think particularly that helps explain why, rather than the pandemic being seen as a spur to the sort of digital innovation that Rachel was talking about, it is now regarded by many students and their parents and the wider public as too often being synonymous with second-rate course delivery and poor value for money, rather than the sort of creative innovation that I know the best of the sector have delivered. And genuine digital innovation, which the Barber Review highlighted early last year, could complement face-to-face for those on campus and lead to more access from students of different backgrounds, both here and abroad. But I fear that the poor experience of too many students over the last 2 years has made it harder to harness the potential of digitization in higher education in England at the moment. And where it is harnessed, it's important that it enhances rather than diminishes the student experience if it's to be successful. So I think there are lessons really that can be learned there. And the third challenge is ensuring that improved access to higher education is accompanied by better outcomes for disadvantaged students, both at university and with the support of universities at schools. There has undoubtedly been a significant improvement in the numbers of disadvantaged students going into higher education over the last 20 years. And that's a tribute to the hard work of many school teachers and widening participation teams in higher education. But there is also an assumption among some that there is an inevitable tension between quality and equality. I recall a similar argument at schools where minimum standards were first introduced. 20% of students getting 5 good GCSEs was seen as okay at the time because particular schools had a lot of disadvantaged students, and that was how the argument went then. And that argument would gain short shrift in the school sector, I think, these days. So it is, of course, true that some students will need greater support in higher education and in education generally because of the extra challenges they face as a result of their background. But I think it's really important that we don't see lower expectations of what they can achieve with the right support because of that disadvantage. And we are hearing versions of that argument with our consultation at the moment on quality, but they are misplaced, whether they come from those challenging ambitious access targets or those with wider access challenging stronger quality expectations. I think we're getting different arguments coming from different parts of the sector towards those access expectations. And as happened in schools, such poverty of expectations should gradually become a thing of the past in higher education too. And I think it's really important that it does. And the alignment between what we're talking about on quality and access is really important here. As John Blake, our new Director of Fair Access and Participation, outlined yesterday, getting this right means universities and schools working together to raise attainment at an earlier stage, and a sharper focus on what works in improving access, participation and outcomes, and garnering robust quantitative evidence for it. So I think if the sector meets these challenges effectively, the result should be a better student experience and, crucially, renewed public respect for our universities and colleges. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you, Conor. I should say, given that you at the start of your remarks talked a bit about student views and student perceptions and ways to take a temperature of students, that I'm very pleased to say that with Alison and her colleagues at Advance HE, we will be doing the Advance HE HEPI Student Academic Experience Survey again this year, which hopefully will be a useful resource for the sector to hear what students currently think. So now, thank you everyone for keeping to time, because it gives us a good half an hour or more to bring in the audience and to listen to their questions and to respond. And I'll take 3 or 4 questions in one go, and then I'll go back to the panel. And panelists, please don't feel you need to respond to every question. Just say what it is you'd like to say that's relevant to the questions posed. And I'm going to start with essentially the questions in the order they've been upvoted. So Emma, are we able to turn on Claire Saunders's microphone? We won't turn on people's cameras, just their microphones, so they can put their own questions. Claire, it'd be helpful to say what institution you're from as well, if you are from an institution.
Hi, Claire Saunders. I'm currently at St Mary's University, Twickenham, which is a tiny little institution in leafy Richmond. And I'm one of those people who kind of has worked in higher education pretty much throughout their career. Just for context, I'm very much an insider. And yeah, it was just a question around, you know, who is higher education for? Who should it be for in the future? I think sometimes we kind of slip back into discourses that assume the old models of kind of school leavers doing 3-year undergraduate degrees prior to entering the world of work for the first time. There's still also kind of lots of debate about kind of where higher education fits in the social mobility agenda, which Ross has alluded to as well. And I just thought, taking that step back, are we really clear on who we're for and perhaps who we're not for, and how that might shape what we do?
Great, thank you, Claire. I'm going to go now to Paul Woodgate. Paul. Hi, Paul. I think you're live now.
Can you hear me? Paul Woodgate.
We can.
I'm a governor of De Montfort University and also on the board of Advance HE. It's interesting listening to the discussion about alternative models. I think people have talked about alternative models of delivery in higher education for a long time now, and lots of institutions have done a lot to create different ways of delivery. But numerically, the vast majority of the demand the sector sees continues to be from either immediate school leavers or recent school leavers wanting 3-year full-time degrees. That's what we see across the sector. I'm interested to know if the panel thinks that picture is going to change and will move away from a situation where that is the core and all those other things sort of sit around it, to something where there is a more genuinely diverse delivery model across the sector.
Thank you, Paul. Let's go to John Abel.
Hello, I'm John from Coventry University. Yeah, just a question really about balancing the needs of international students if in the future they'll be the ones paying for this growth of higher education against very much the topic of conversation so far, which has been regional needs in levelling up.
Thank you, John. It sounds like you're having a party there, which is good to hear. So let's go to the panel. I think for the first round, I'll go in the same order that we went before. Rachel, which of those points would you like to pick up?
I'm interested in Claire's point on who is higher education for. And I think there's a danger. Gavin Williamson last year briefly floated the idea of caps on student numbers. And I think that would be a huge mistake for the government to impose caps. I think you have to say that higher education is for whoever wants to go there, you know, and it may not be the same sort of ivory tower type of higher education that has been, you know, historically for the most academic. But I think, you know, you have to encourage aspiration. That's good for social mobility. That's good for the economy. And there is a sort of brilliant analysis in the same pamphlet that I mentioned by David Bullitz earlier, where he points out that the sort of notorious trouble spots where over 60% of people go to university. I've got the list here. It's, you know, Wimbledon, Richmond Park, Chelsea and Fulham, Battersea, Hitchin and Harpenden, Kensington, Chesham and Amersham, Chipping, Barnet. So if you're going to limit who goes onto higher education, you're basically saying that people who currently, you're either saying to those voters and their children, you know, those people, you can't go anymore, or you're saying to people who currently don't go in more disadvantaged areas, tough, you can't join this life improving opportunity. So I think I would say I think it's a really interesting debate, but I think you have to say that you're as wide and access and opportunity and population as possible. I'd be really interested what others think, though.
Thank you, Rachel. Rachel, and just before you give up the mic, the question about new providers, were you so impressed by places like Dyson and UA92 that you thought that really was the future, or will it always be a more limited part of the sector, do you think?
I genuinely don't know. I was impressed by both those places, and I noticed someone in the chat has pointed out that the UA92 actually isn't officially a university, it's a university academy, strictly speaking, but Gary Neville loves to talk about it as a university because he wants to tweak the tail of the establishment. He thinks anything he can do to stir it up is great and sort of cause disruption. But I think that it's more about it was the relevance, it was the sort of link with employment. I thought it was the attractiveness to students. I thought in both cases, they seem to have created a model that when we've got these worries about students leaving with huge amount of debt and questions about whether or not what's the value of some degrees, I thought there was definitely, I was impressed by both of those. What I don't know is whether, and I think there will be a market for those kinds of different courses, but whether or not that becomes the dominant model or whether we just get a more mixed market, I think it's interesting.
Thank you. And there are some invitations for you to visit one or two other institutions in the chat, I see. So Ross, over to you.
Thank you, Nick. And Rachel, you're more than welcome to come with a hard hat and visit ARU Peterborough. I just want to pick up on Paul Woodgate's point around kind of the different modes of delivery and the like, and why it has been talked about for many years and hasn't really came to fruition at any great scale. Well, I think there's kind of an easy answer to that, which is the funding system hasn't really allowed it. And the metrics make it incredibly difficult as well. So when you measure and time test against it. So the funding systems speak to the OU or Birkbeck, and another represented here today. At times the funding system just makes it impermeable for people to be able to bring in different modes of study effectively at scale. And in the metrics, and I was involved in the subject level TEF, at times it was really difficult to recognise whether there was difference within there. When you start to bring data up into large groupings, when you don't recognise that difference within the metrics that are produced, then it makes it really difficult then to reward where innovation has been placed. So I think the challenge is to make sure that the system is in place that allows us to have those differences. And just very quickly on Claire's point from St Mary's, and St Mary's isn't a tiny little institution, it's highly successful, and Claire, we watch with interest what you are doing there. But what I would say is around who is it for, I think from my point of view, all too often it is not seen for many parts of our society, universities, whether it's actually about them attending a higher education course or them taking a sense of ownership of it. How many people in your local community have walked across the threshold and onto a campus, have engaged with all the wonderful things that we do? And I think we're failing society if we aren't bringing them onto campus and getting out as well to ensure what we're doing and what impact we're having beyond just the traditional teaching and learning element.
Thank you, Ross. And just John Abel's point about international students, I mean, you want to deliver for the people of Peterborough, but presumably you want some international students on campus too. Is there a tension there?
No, I don't see a tension through my experience with other institutions. As long as you get the balance right, you ensure that people understand why we have international students and you support the staff to deliver on that. Where I've seen the benefit of it is where people who maybe are from backgrounds where they haven't came across people from a range of countries, being able to sit in a classroom together, share ideas and concepts. I mean, they know the benefits of internationalising the curriculum, but firsthand it makes a difference. But even beyond that, just a very small project we did when we were in Hertfordshire, which was to get our Chinese students out to teach Chinese in the local primary schools. Transformative, really got them to understand why those students were here in this country, what they're trying to make back in their own country, and also just open up their horizons. And I think more of that, the better.
Thank you. I wonder if just before we go to Conor, we might hear from Chris Parr, because his question is particularly aimed at Conor. Chris Parr's a journalist for Research Professional. Chris.
Yeah, I think I'm on now. Good morning. We're obviously talking about the future of HE. In the near future, the OFS is talking about introducing a threshold for the proportion of a university's graduates that go into so-called professional jobs, and threaten to decimate their finances if they fail to meet those thresholds. Removal from the register would be very, very damaging. I guess my question is there a risk that this will perversely incentivize universities to recruit those students it feels have the best chance of flourishing after university? And could that mean, that the recruitment of disadvantaged students ends up being viewed as more of a risk?
Conor, over to you.
Okay, I mean, I'll come to Chris's point in a second, which is actually what I was sort of trying to address, I think, in my remarks. I think who higher education is for, it is for people of different ages, different backgrounds. It's why access and the sort of work that John was talking about yesterday that I mentioned in my remarks is so important. There is still a lot of work to do in widening access in our more selective universities particularly, but also in making sure that those who do get access get a good outcome at the end of their time at university or college or on one of the newer providers. So that's why it's important that there is regulation in place. And I think that comes to Chris's point. I mean, the thresholds that we have set are intended to provide a balance between very ambitious targets and what is sustainable and what is reasonable within the sector. But as I also I think said in the remarks, we will be taking into account context. So there will be some sectors where the tradition in employment is going to be very different and will have a different pattern, and they may not be categorized specifically as professional jobs, but they're clearly jobs that need a degree or normally need a degree at this time. So I think we will be using the figures, the threshold figures, if you like, as a sign that something may be going wrong, but it's not the final judgment. And I think we'll want to look quite closely at what's happening in individual providers, individual universities and colleges before we take further judgment. So I think, and the consultation, I think, is very, very clear on that. When it comes to the alternative models, I think this is a really interesting question because when the regulatory system of which OFS is part was set up, I think there was very much an ambition to try and get significant extra diversity in place. I think we're seeing some great diversity like Dyson that has been mentioned, and I'm sure what Ross is doing will contribute to that diversity as well. But I think we also probably need to be realistic that the majority of those who are going into higher education will probably, for the foreseeable future, be from the sort of 18 to 21 background. We have, I think, arrested a decline in mature students, but the numbers are still not going to make the difference that would change their proportion. But it may be in different models, and I think one of the things that's going to be quite important is what the government is proposing in terms of changing to greater modularity and changing the funding so that there is funding that recognises modularity. That has the potential to support different types of models. But I don't think we should be afraid of setting minimum thresholds, because otherwise we are failing those from disadvantaged backgrounds who have a right to expect minimum standards. And if we don't get those standards right, if we don't have those thresholds in place, they're the ones who are going to lose out most.
Thank you, Conor. Let's go back to the audience. Lots of questions coming in. I'll try to take 4, I think, this time. There's one from Mary Kernock-Cook, which I will read out because she's somewhere noisy. And Mary is, of course, chairing the Student Futures Commission, which is another very important commission looking at the future of education with a particular focus on students. And Mary asks, what one big change should universities make, systemic or tonal or offer-wise, maybe that was otherwise, to change the current public discourse that so denigrates them? So what can they do to change that discourse? Diana. Now, Diana has got a question about digital education, and Diana knows more about digital education than anybody I've ever met before. So can we turn on Diana's microphone?
I should be unmuted now. I hope that's okay. Thank you.
You are.
Well, reacting to what Rachel said right at the beginning about the lack of digital innovation in higher education, and also I think Conor mentioned digitalisation as well in the OFS consultation, but we have such a controlling context for education, the policy context and strategy context in the UK. And we've been discussing these things for more than 2 decades. I mean, I was on the Deering Committee, so I remember well, these issues were all there as well. Look where conventional methods have got us. Are we really turning our face against digital methods now? There's no mention of it in the DFE strategies and policies. There's no mention of it except in rather negative terms in the OFS consultation. And yet, the past 2 years have shown us how the teaching community has stepped up to this. There has been a fantastic revolution in the way that teachers have been able to support students, have discovered that digital is not necessarily second rate by any means. It has a lot of advantages and benefits. And even the wonky research was showing that both teachers and students want more online learning alongside the campus experience. We cannot lose that. That's very important. But we have not been able to innovate because we haven't done it so well that those last 2 years, precisely because the sector wasn't ready for it. It hadn't been preparing for anything like digital innovation. So my real question is, can we imagine a better relationship between government and the sector that does enable innovative models to develop?
Thank you. And then we'll have one more, and then we'll go back to the panel, and then I hope we'll get one more round of questions in as well before the end. So let's go to James Flynn. James, remind people what institution you're from, and the microphone is yours.
Yeah, good morning, James Flynn from Birmingham City University. So my question's around the civic role that universities play. So it feels like on the one hand, the ask from John Blake yesterday that universities start to work with schools could have a big benefit for access. But on the other hand, when you start to weigh up all the asks that universities are having, you bring in more and more roles for the university. So in terms of policing, universities are having to look at on-campus security, particularly nighttime safety and spiking. They're picking up where the NHS could arguably step in on mental health and addiction support. And when you look at the ask around prevent as well, even though that's on all sorts of institutions, there's a counter-terrorism role as well. And now when you're being asked to improve schooling, my question is, if you take all of those roles seriously in terms of your being a good civic institution, is there a point where taking that role seriously becomes all-encompassing?
Thank you, James. Now, there won't be time probably for the 3 panelists to answer every single question each, particularly as I'd like to get another round in, but which points would you like to address? Let's go to Ross first on these 3 questions.
Thanks, Nick. I'll pick up the last point around the kind of civic role. I don't think it is recognised that it goes back to my point about, you know, if you want something done, ask a university, because we have been able to pick up and deliver a whole range of agendas for the government. You look at the arguments on autonomy, but often we're agents of the state in the delivery of what is required. My argument on this is some of that's fine as long as we're funded appropriately to do so. If we are doing the heavy lifting around some of the community interaction, if we're helping to raise attainment in schools, then we need to be appropriately funded and supported to do so, because we also have the day job as an institution. So these things all make great sense, but we need to come to a funding settlement that really says, again, back to the point about why a university's wider benefit can be seen, is how do we make sure that that is appropriately supported and recognised as well through a regulator, that we have got a role beyond just the teaching and learning and arguably research in terms of the impact in the communities in which we're in. So I'd say that the funding element, and just very quickly on Mary's point about what one thing could we do, I think it's about being bold. I think we are not shouting enough about our benefit to society. We are not shouting enough about what we are doing as institutions. So I think we need to put some energy into that and really get the argument to the public about the benefit we have.
Thank you, Ross. Let's go to Conor.
Thanks, Nick. I mean, I think it is for universities, colleges, other providers to help change the public discourse. I think strong regulation can give confidence, but it is actually going to be down to what is said by the providers that will make that difference. And I think that comes to the digital point as well. And the point I was trying to make on that is that I think there was a real opportunity during the pandemic to have a significant advance in acceptability for digitization. The problem is it's become an issue about whether you're getting tutor time, contact time with tutors, and attending lectures in person, and all the rest of it. And I think that's because it was sometimes there was an overcaution sometimes about that face-to-face contact. But you know, while it may not be a significant part of some of our consultation documents, we did publish the Barber Review, as independent review earlier in the year, and that Barber Review has got a lot of interesting and optimistic and innovative ideas in there. And I think it is for the sector to show and to demonstrate the difference that can be made. And sometimes I think that you know, there can be an over defensiveness, and I've seen it in other parts of the education sector as well, whereas actually going out positively and showing what can be done and showing that it isn't contradicting or working against the sort of face-to-face and on-campus experience, which is clearly important as well. I think that's where the difference can be made.
Thank you, Conor. Rachel.
Sorry. On the digitalisation point, I think it's such an interesting question from Diana, and Conor obviously referencing it as well, but it's somehow to harness technology to personalise the education, not turn it, it's not an either or. So obviously you need the in-person teaching as well, but technology and online learning can open up a whole vast universe of, you know, the best lectures in the world to students, or even using AI to personalize learning. I've seen that at work in schools, and I can see ways in which for certain subjects that could also be useful in universities. But the point is to position it as a personalization rather than a sort of minimizing the personal, you know, the individual education for the student. And to Mary's point, I think this kind of somehow reconnecting education to employment may be key to this, so that you're showing the purpose of higher education and universities. It isn't, and just, you know, much less focus on the sort of stupid trivia of who's banned which speaker. So I was speaking to the principal of Hertford yesterday at Hertford College in Oxford about he's running courses on 21st century skills and how to prepare young people there for the jobs that they're going to do in future. So, and that's a complete contrast with the rows that you've had at Christchurch College, Oxford, over the dean. And so it's somehow making the case that education is relevant, and higher education has a purpose beyond itself and beyond the ivory towers and beyond the sort of internal rows that go on. That's, I think, probably the way to break through to the public and also sort of counteract the kind of negative culture war politics that we've seen.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm going to take one more round of questions and then we'll go back to the panelists for their answers to those and any final comments they would like to make. I'm going to start with Helen Perkins, which is also about HE employer links. And Helen, remind people, your picture gives a clue, but remind people where you're from.
Hi, I'm Helen Perkins and I'm the Director CEO of the Society for Research in Higher Education. If they're still willing to be associated with me, the debate I'm going to be just asking about, goes back a very long way into the Association of Graduate Recruiters and even beyond that. So I'm really was, listening initially, of course, to Rachel, and then obviously the rest of the debate. But I think particularly the things that Rachel was saying about, the whole interface between higher education and employability does still seem to be stuck, way back in the 1980s. No disrespect to anybody, because that's where I was stuck for a while. And I really want to try and see whether we can change that debate quite substantially at this opportunity that you've given us, Nick, because I think it's out of step with the students who are coming through. I also think the perspective of students is changing dramatically, and what they're looking for, I don't think, is sufficiently being understood. The debates of skills for graduates in the 21st century still seems to be dominating, and I'd like to flip that round. I think it would be really far more valuable now, because there are so many universities who are doing and are undervalued and under-recognised for doing a hell of an amount to put forward students that are having success in getting the careers they want, to look at what type of career does a student at the 21st century want, and how is higher education, supporting them in that, and picking up on Paul Fox's point. I think employers are getting, and I can speak on both sides, having just recruited to excellent mid-career and young PhD students. They are getting the skills that they want. They are matching, changing trends. And Paul Fox has said, it always used to be he who pays the piper, and it always was a he, calls the tune. I just don't think that's relevant. But we do need, and it's come up, Johnny Rich has put something in about my point about, credit accumulation, transfer and portability of higher education. I really think that is something that we have to look at more permanently, because the circumstances of students are changing in all sorts of different ways, and for them not to have that opportunity is going to be a barrier to them getting the careers that they're looking for. So talking about flipping that around a bit.
Thank you, Helen. And we're actually going to go straight to Johnny Rich, who was just mentioned. Johnny.
Thanks very much, Nick. I didn't actually want to talk about portability right now, but I'm very happy to on some future occasion. But the what I wanted to talk about was the question of whoever pays the piper picks the tune. Because if we want to define what the future of HE should look like, one of the best incentives to steer it is, of course, the funding. And there are many beneficiaries of higher education, and we can build a system around the students, the graduates, the employers, the public good, whether that's an economic good or a social good, or one that balances all of these more likely. But that choice depends on the funding model that we use and how we. So should the funding follow those people who happen to be benefiting, or those parties that happen to be benefiting, or should we define who we want to benefit by designing the funding around that?
Thank you, Johnny. And Johnny's written a very interesting paper in the past about how employers might be forced to contribute more to higher education. I'm going to go final question, then back to the panel. Steve Dover. Steve, you've put 3 questions, I think, in the chat. So choose which one of your questions you'd like to ask and put to the panel.
Okay, so just listening to the debate, which is great, and thanks for this. Great insights. I'm going to pick on something that has an affordability part to it, and the digital and blended learning area that many people have touched upon. And my question is, the large universities have large estates. The environmental impact of these is significant. Why are universities failing to grasp the opportunity of flexing blended and distance learning models and redesigning pedagogies to suit, and so reducing estates' footprints whilst catering for increased numbers of students, which would drive up revenues? And if the pedagogies are right, it would also drive up educational outcomes, and it also plays to the inclusivity part of what we've been talking about as well.
Thank you, Steve. Great. So I'm going to go back to the panel now. It's your chance to respond to those three contributions, and also to respond to any of the comments you've read in the chat, or indeed to say anything else you would like to say. We have a hard cut-off at 1:15, but that gives us about 3 minutes each to convey any further remarks you'd like. Let's go in reverse order this time. So let's go to Conor first.
Thanks, Nick. I mean, I think employability and what it means is a really important debate, and obviously the nature of employment has changed, and the nature of expectations has changed, and it is important that that's reflected, and it is important that that context is there. But I think it's also important that we see employment outcomes as something which is an expectation for all universities, colleges, and other higher education providers. And that we look at it, with a recognition of appropriate context, as I said earlier, but that we continue to sort of recognise where there are changes in societies and the economic expectations too about that employment. And one of the things that I think has changed over the last 20 or so years is that I think that's important of all courses. There was a time when when certain courses were seen as vocational or professional, and other courses, maybe like some of the humanities courses that Nick and I studied, were not seen in the same context. So, but I think there is an increasing expectation there that internships alongside apprenticeships, alongside work experience, is something that is and needs to be an important part of the conversation, regardless of which courses are in place. Just on the other point, I'm not going to comment on funding models. I think it's beyond my pay grade, and I am an independent, I am a civil servant. I think those are decisions for government. But I think the point that Steve made about the pedagogical models and whether you can get that blending, I think, that's something that the Barber Review looked at. It's also something that I think we had a real opportunity over the last 2 years to demonstrate effectively. I fear it's been pushed back a bit by the experience of too many students, and the sense that actually what they were getting was lectures on screen rather than the personalised experience that Rachel was alluding to earlier. But I don't think we should be disheartened by that. I think the opportunity there for the sector, and particularly for innovative and diverse providers, is to show what can be done, and to show that it genuinely enhances the experience for students, and not rather than diminishing it. So I think that's something that the sector needs to demonstrate, and has the opportunity to demonstrate in the coming years, and learning the lessons from the pandemic as part of that.
Thank you, Conor, and thanks again for doing this today, because I know it's been a very busy week for the OFS with John Blake's first speeches and the new announcement of the interim leadership and what have you. So thanks for those remarks. I'm going to go to Ross now, and particularly interested, Ross, in your answer to this question of whether we're spending too much on estates, given that you're building a new estate in Peterborough.
Thank you. I think, the point that Steve makes, I think, is well made around how universities use estates, and how often would you go onto a campus of a weekend and find labs sitting empty, classrooms sitting empty. And if you look at usage stats that are produced by directors of estates across our campuses, they're not really what we would expect to see going forward. ARU Peterborough will be different. It'll be different by design. First of all, we're looking at how we stretch that day as much as possible. We get as many people in. The mode of delivery is part of that. So those are already in employment. The times when you will be able to engage with higher education will, mean that we will have an efficient day and efficient use of the spaces. But also the point Steve made about what kind of spaces you've got on campus are really important. So for us, over half of the space we have is specialist spaces. Our health simulation labs, biomedical labs, our robotics and mechatronics, these kind of things where people, when they're coming onto campus, they're solving some real life problems, they're engaging with them. So I think it's important to getting the right types of spaces for that. I think that does help it become efficient. And just kind of two last points, Nick, if I can, one of which is on the funding model. And I've been really clear in the past and in various forums around the model needs to be looked at. I think it's everyone has to contribute, the student has to contribute, the employers, and we don't talk enough about that, but the employers have to contribute. And I think wider society does to the kind of tax system. So having a model that balances means that we can all be true stakeholders in it. And the very last point around that, I was talking about institutions talking themselves up in the community. What I would want to make clear is we can't just do it ourselves. So we need to make sure that those businesses that you're working with, whether it be on KTPs or research innovation, they should be advocating for you, the civic leaders, your leaders of councils of all flavours and all colours, and also your graduates out there talking about the benefit you're having. So make sure you're getting them to be bold on your behalf.
Thank you, Ross. And then the final word to you, Rachel.
I'd like to address this point on estates because I think it's interesting, but I think it depends on who you've got going to university. So at the moment, higher education is almost a rite of passage. It's that sort of 3-year going away from home, majority 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds at the beginning. And it's as much about that kind of learning to live away from home, learning to live independently as it is about the education, I think. But I suspect over time that's going to change. And so there will then be more scope for reform to estates as well as learning.
Thank you, Rachel. Just before I bring it to a close, I'm just going to take chair's prerogative and just put one further point to Ross, if I may. Ross, one thing that intrigues me about your initiative is I keep seeing very positive comments from your local MP, the local Conservative MP, Paul Bristow, about what you're doing in Peterborough. And yet the general, and he's a sort of relatively loyal Conservative backbencher, and yet the sort of messages coming out of the government could sometimes be interpreted as rather opposed to the sort of initiative you're doing. Is that an unfair characterization? Is the government broadly helpful or broadly unhelpful to what you're trying to do?
I think the narrative isn't helpful for the sector, but certainly for what we're doing in Peterborough, we've had support. Obviously, the Chancellor, people may have picked up, came and visited and was really clear about the support given to what we're doing. You can see the benefits, again, the economic benefits of a high-skilled workforce on there. I think it goes back to that, but I think we need to pick off the MPs and make it really clear that this is what benefit it's having in their communities. Whether the members of the community will progress ever to university, it's still benefiting them. Having doctors that are wanting to work in the NHS in your local area because there's a university nearby that allows you to teach is going to give you a benefit. And I kind of go back to a really annoying argument that used to be made, which is, why does the dustman pay for the doctor? Well, I can give you 100 reasons why, because it benefits us all.
Thank you so much. I just want to end, and I'll give Alison a chance to say anything she'd like to say as well, but I'd just like to say thank you on behalf of HEPI and Advance HE to all three speakers, to my colleague Emma, who's done a lot of the work behind the scenes, to Alison's colleagues Kat and William and others at Advance HE, who've also done a lot to make today happen. And just before I bring it to a close, Alison, would you any final reflections from you?
No, thank you. You've said it all, Nick, and so the speaker. It's been a fascinating debate, one we need to have regularly. And good luck, Rachel, with your commission. Thank you, everybody.
And the final thing I might say, again, on behalf of Alison and myself, is that this is the start of a series. So our next event is on March the 10th on EDI, and a colleague from Advance HE will be chairing that one, and also the third one in the series later on. So do look out for those. Many thanks. The recording will be available on our website, hopefully later today, if anybody would like to watch it back or bring it to the attention of their colleagues. And thanks again to everyone who's involved this morning, and to all of you for staying till the end. Many thanks. Have a good day.